Welcome everyone to Photography, Power and the Ethics of Representation, Imaged by History. This is the second in a series of dialogues facilitated by Neelika Jayawardane with panelists Benjamin Chesterton, Candice Jansen, Sarah Sentiles, and Asim Rafiki. My name is Amy Sodin, and I'm a researcher and curator at VIAD, the Visual Identities in Art and Design Research Center, where Neelika is a research associate. For those who are new to our work, VIAD is a research center based at the University of Johannesburg in South Africa and supports a global community of academics, curators, and artists. Today's panel discussion forms part of VIAD's digital platform entitled Reading the Moment. The platform is designed to share what members of our research community are thinking, feeling, and doing in response to conditions of racism and violence, as well as the alternative possibilities enacted through radical as well as everyday practices of freedom. If you'd like to stay informed on upcoming Reading the Moment releases, please do sign up for the VIAD mailing list, and I'll place a link in the chat. We would like to thank the Institute for Global Engagement at the State University of New York, Oswego, and the English department at SUNY-Oswego, whose generous support has made this online conversation series possible. And for those who haven't been able to join us, the conversation will be recorded and available on the VIAD website. We are incredibly privileged to be a part of this conversation today, in which we return to questions of ethics and structural violences within the realm of imaging and photography. With Neelika, our panelists will talk about practices of predation within photography and the systems and organizations that become complicit in these practices. As mentioned earlier, Neelika Jayawardane is Associate Professor of English at the State University of New York, Oswego, and a Research Associate at VIAD. She is a recipient of the 2018 Creative Capital Andy Warhol Foundation Arts Writers Grant for a book project on the Afropix, a South African photographers agency that operated during the last decade of apartheid. Benjamin Chesterton is a former dishwasher, cook, teacher, and BBC radio documentary producer. In 2008, he co-founded the company Duck Rabbit with a view to marrying his passion for telling people's stories with his love of photography. He is currently working on a documentary about online child sexual abuse in collaboration with Interpol and the Human Dignity Foundation. Candice Jansen writes on photography. She conducted her doctoral research at WISER, the Wits Institute for Social and Economic Research, as a PhD fellow in art history. She is responsible for research, archives, and exhibitions programming at the Market Photo Workshop in Johannesburg, and in 2019 was appointed as a research associate with Visual Identities in Art and Design at the University of Johannesburg. Sarah Sentiles is a writer, teacher, critical theorist, scholar of religion, and author of many books, including Draw Your Weapons, which won the 2018 PEN Award for Creative Nonfiction. Her next book, Stranger Care, will be published by Random House in May 2021. At the core of her scholarship, writing and activism is a commitment to investigating the roles, language, images, and practices play in oppression, violence, social transformation, and justice movements. Asim Rafiki is an academic researcher and independent photographer whose work has appeared in Newsweek, Time Magazine, Harper's Magazine, Stern Magazine, National Geographic France, and many other publications. Asim has reported from Haiti, Japan, India, Pakistan, the USA, Afghanistan, Israel, Palestine, Sweden, and Ukraine, among other places. He authors the photography and politics blog, The Spinning Head. On behalf of VIAD, I would just like to thank all of you for being here with us today and for sharing in your expertise. We so appreciate and value your willingness to participate in this very important and challenging discussion. And for our audience members following our discussion, I will be facilitating a Q&A, so please do enter your questions in the chat function so that it may be answered by the panelists. And so I'll now hand over to Neelika. Thank you.
I think Neelika's frozen. Is that just me? Yeah, I think her internet's gone, Amy.
Yes, I think so too. Let me just get in touch with her and let's see if we can get her back on.
In the meantime, I'll ask a question. I'll start with Asim because I know you better than anyone else in the room. We talked about the mention of the spinning head blog, correct? And it's quite a seminal blog in the photography community. I think you're one of the first voices to raise so many issues about the way that photographs were being taken and the distance between how we talk about them and how they're actually created. And maybe you could just start by talking a little bit, introduce that blog and what your thinking is, and why was that so radical at the time? That's what very much surprised me when I started getting into photography. Why you know your writing was considered so radical at the time.
Yeah, I think that's one of the sad things, isn't it? That the fact that I was writing, where I wrote a few essays, and they were nothing really that special or radical, let's be honest. And it was in 2008, 2009. So we're not talking about 20, 30 years ago. We're talking about, a moment in this industry when.
Hello.
Hi, Neelika. The fact of the matter was, so 2008, my career, as a photographer, sort of began in a very contentious moment in the industry. Not only was the media industry changing, the entire political economy, and now I'm talking about the United States and somewhat of Europe, but we're looking at the time when digital media was emerging and the political economy of news was changing, which is not one of the subjects that, of course, nobody wants to talk about. And the war on terror had begun, and I happened to be a Pakistani, and suddenly in the eyes of every editor in the world, this is what I was. I was always my ethnicity. So I start working in around 2002. So you can see the timing, like it's really just around September 11th. And for the first few years, I fooled myself into thinking that I was being hired by all these publications because I was such a talented photographer. And they were calling me, and I'm thinking to myself, wow, I'm just such hot shit. I'm getting all these assignments, I'm being sent to, and the thing is, I'm always only being sent to Pakistan. Anyway, so a few years go by, and it becomes very apparent to me as to what I was actually doing. And it became very apparent to me, especially when I started to bring back narratives that went beyond the war or terror framing. I wanted to, I'm a Kashmiri born in Pakistan, and obviously, I'm trying to produce not just the assignments, but I'm producing other kinds of bodies of work. I'm a young photographer. I keep bringing these stories about Pakistan they don't seem to be interested in, and they couldn't care less. And there was this one moment when I was on assignment for Newsweek where this is right after the first assassination attempt on Benazir Bhutto. I actually had an editor who actually came in, who basically over the phone said, just make up the photographs. And I was literally stunned, because I was stunned at my naivete, because no one else in my team, my fixer and so on, seemed to think that that was a big deal. And here I am with my silly pretensions of documenting truth and so on and so forth. So the blog emerged from this place where I started to question, like, what the hell, what is really going on here? Because every time I go back and I try to talk to these people about narratives and stories and interesting ways of seeing the world, complicating the narrative of Pakistan, blah, they couldn't give a shit. They basically kept coming back. So I started to write this small blog about these kinds of issues, the way Pakistan was framed. So my earliest posts were about the way, I wrote this post called Only Interesting If It's Madness. I remember it's one of my first posts, about the fact that if you were from a Muslim country, or you were Muslim or Islamic or what have you, there was only one frame to speak about that country, the world, its history, and it was always terrorism. And I was left very confused. And it's interesting you began there, Ben, because now I think a lot of you know that there's this scandal around the Syrian ISIS member who got arrested in Canada, and we've now found out it's a hoax. I have these posts, my first posts from 2008 were about the fact that any journalist could go to Pakistan and claim that they had breakfast with suicide bombers, and nobody was checking the facts. This is one of my early, in fact, Rukmini Calamachi is in a post I wrote in 2009 for a story she did on ISIS informant in a prison in Germany. And I wrote this post about why isn't anyone asking her about her sources and the claims she's making? But nobody cared. My fixer wrote a story about having breakfast with a suicide bomber. And it was just and this is where this blog comes from. It was just basically me falling off my high horse and realizing that there's something else going on here, and it's sad. And I've written this, it's sad that the blog was, I mean, just even the fact that you use the word radical, I don't think it was very radical. I think it was just direct. It was very simplistically written, and it was very much in your face. And it was just calling editors and photographers for their bullshit. And the fact that people thought I was, such a troublemaker, I think is a reflection of the very limited self-critique the industry has.
Right. And
I think this is the fundamental problem. It wasn't that I was doing something really remarkable. It was the fact that nobody was doing anything. And it continues, and it still continues. So yeah.
I mean, that's in fact how I got to know you, was because of the blog. And I think at the time you were on Twitter, and I was just beginning to write about images at the time, and had kind of moved away from writing about literary kind of criticism, doing literary work, and finding it far more interesting to write about the image world. And I saw your blog, and this was the first time that some of the things I'd been thinking about and knew, but didn't have the kind of ability to speak about, that somebody was writing it. And
and it just came from things we saw in the field. And by the way, not just me, I mean, every photographer has seen this. I mean, in fact, there's this amazing audio interview with Paolo Pellegrin when he is covering the removal of Israeli settlers from Gaza. And this interview is not online anymore, but I have it on my blog, where he actually says that he could see, for example, that the settlers and the Israeli soldiers are coordinating things, that photographers are being taken to where the hot photographs are going to be. But of course, no one pays attention to that. It's not that these photographers, that I saw something unique. I was just the guy who decided to write about it. But, people who are in the field, journalists, photographers, anyway, they know these things. They see these things. They talk about them over drinks. So they just mention them when they win the awards, so.
I just got booted off the internet, so I couldn't formally introduce all of you, and thank you. So everyone, thank you all for registering and coming to the conversation. Anyone who's a member of the audience right now, and to Amy Saudin and to James McDonald's at the Visual Identities and Design at the University of Johannesburg, Ulysses Mejia, who's the chair of the chair of IGE at my university, and the chair of my department, Lee Wilson, who've been incredibly supportive towards this series. So during my own early years at university in the US, that's really, I think, the origins of my critical education was, I was just thrilled to see even women's magazines, the fashion magazines, the beautiful ones like Vogue and W, that included rare images of what was home to me, glossy vistas of African savannas with white models in $10,000 outfits. And in the background, decoratively dressed Maasai who would stand watch with long spears in their hand. And it was always the Maasai Moran, the warrior, and there was never Maasai women hanging around any of those fashion shoots. And so sometimes a Black person stood in the model service, holding a rifle, bringing coffee to camp, or in the final evening wear part of a photo story. All of you who've ever seen a fashion magazine knows how the photo story works. Like the model moves from like daytime casually stuff to the night evening wear stuff. And she would always be kind of being serviced or sitting or posing in jewels and fine evening wear. And somebody would be in the background, a Black person, and we'd know they were a service person because they're wearing some sort of ill-fitting waitstaff white, and sometimes with that kind of red conical, what is sometimes associated with Turkish hats in colonial kind of images, if you know what I'm talking about. And that's always present in those kinds of fashion images. And at the time, I was so deeply homesick that even these images that capitalized on colonial nostalgia and white supremacist fantasies of Africa meant something to me. In America, home, whatever that complicated belonging and non-belonging I had to such vistas, was absent from the image and narrative field. That absence meant that most people in my Midwestern university routinely looked at me blankly or repeated a list of unimaginative racist nonsense after they asked where I came from. And, you know, I'm off that Live Aid and Tony Blair, Africa is a scar on the conscience of the world generation. So you can imagine what people thought when they heard anything to do with Africa. It was a rare farmer father of a college friend who would listen to the public radio on his combine harvester, who would know that there was a drought in Zambia and most of Southern Africa. Another knew what Nguni cattle was and how suited they were to the semi-desert high plains. They too knew how to wax poetically about the beauty of a cow, comparing the rich honey brown on their hides to polished maple wood, though they had only seen pictures of such beauties. It was during these early years in America, along with an immersion in fashion images, that I began to think about how imperial histories were imbricated in our present image repertoires. The years after 9/11, as many Americans were being prepared for the invasion of Afghanistan and Iraq, those provided a much harsher education. I was in postgrad programs by this time, and I knew immediately what the images coming out of the embedded journalist programs were doing, the Orientalist work they were continuing, all whilst claiming impartiality and objectivity. Later, as I began to write about photography, I encountered that special brand of African photographer, neither journalist nor documentarian, but the art image maker whose work for the front pages of newspapers, not for the front pages of newspapers, but the art gallery, museum, and collectors' homes. They hid behind the narrative of artistic freedom, enjoyed the white privilege of being a European or North American in African countries, and produced heart of darkness narratives in their images. These sold for thousands, tens of thousands of dollars in Italy, Germany, and North America. And I'm going to try to show you some of these images. And as some of the panelists have said, you can't make it up, this kind of image. So it's really sort of impossible to actually word how crazy they seem. There you go. Okay. So the first, I've got some photographs of Vivienne Sassons, whose work is often described as gorgeous, inscrutable fine art images from Africa, which have earned her acclaim and a place in the Museum of Modern Art that seem to be about Africans whose features are often lost in the shadows of some kind of tropical abundant flora, or, often. And there's also Nicola Decalzo, whose work also is in the same tradition. And often the person's skin tone is darkened post-production kind of work, and then flattened into the background, as is you can see in this particular image. And there's more of this here. Nicola claims to be photographing the entirety of the aftermath of the transatlantic slave trade. He goes to every single country along North and South America and any of the islands in the Atlantic. And it's an enormous project, and nobody has said this seems like a pointless endeavor where you are photographing just Black people, and especially poor Black people, in very exoticized positions. And then often Africans whose features are purposefully darkened and flattened into caricatures, and they're always doing something really weird, like this man who seems to be climbing a wall. Like, who does that? No one is doing that. No one has time to do that. And then there's all this banana stuff. I have no idea why the bananas come. Maybe people are very pleased to see the bananas. But yeah, nobody walks around like, I don't know, hiding behind banana fronds, unless maybe there was rain, and that would be like my grandfather's era. And then there's a whole lot of Peter Hugo images, and he does not just concentrate on Africa, obviously. Here he is in Nigeria in the early 2000s, and here he is in Mexico. And I had the great pleasure of being at the kind of residency that he was invited to go to by a very privileged Mexican person who was a cultural attaché in South Africa. And that's how he met all these South African art elites. And his residency had only invited white South African artists. And I think eventually he did invite me and a few others, because a few of those white artists actually complained and said to him that, what are you doing? There's only white people here. And that's how come I got to go last minute, because he invited me on Instagram. And I know. So then I got to see what his work in what he did in Mexico, which were just as stereotypical. So it's not just Africa that's stereotyped, it's any place. And what he did here was to photograph like reenactments of drug cartel killings. So that's why this body is in sort of under a plastic. And he had a whole series of like hyena pictures in Nigeria, and there's another. And here's more of the work that he did in Mexico. And Peter Hugo is apparently, he said, and he did say also at the residency, kind of which culminated in a conference, Mexicans have a very strong visual sensibility. And I thought, well, so does everybody. And he also kind of was so surprised that Catholicism was very much an influence there. And so I realized like how much this art photography hokum allows people to carry on in that very kind of colonial and racist tradition and not be called out on it, because you'll always be accused of being, preventing some kind of freedom. I'm laughing, but it is also very serious business. You might have seen like Peter Hugo's work sold for 50,000 British pounds or more. And so that's not a joke, it sold at Christie's. In the past year alone, we've learned a lot about the ways in which predatory practices of several photographers have been protected and supported, often for decades, by venerable photography organizations and individuals in positions of authority. And despite lip service, most photojournalism institutions and editorial boards and news organizations are white, and or they cater to dominant cultural views of the other, whoever that other may be. They make decisions about where and whom money and career-altering awards of visual space, exhibition space, critical writing in those institutions, publications, invitations to do residencies, awards, all of that, how they are doled out. And sometimes these institutions and news organizations claim to support minoritized photographers, but year after year, newsrooms in the geopolitical West remain largely white. Selection committees and juries for many of the most prestigious prizes for photojournalism are composed of solely white people in directorial and staff positions. And it's this well-meaning kind of benign liberalism that selects who gets a platform and what kind of aesthetic is a winner. And that, I think, has a much longer lasting impact. Our second dialogue that we've organized focuses on how these violent practices and the aesthetics we've come to associate with what we think of as a good photograph are threaded through the history and present of photography, how our images and the ways in which we make images informed by lineages of power and used to veil imperial ventures, capitalist violence, violence against women. If photography has been and continues to be essential for amassing liberal support for aggression, exclusion, and covering up violence, how might photo editors, publications, and photography institutions work against these ingrained practices? So since a couple of you have introduced yourselves a little bit and talked about your work, I might ask those of you who haven't yet, which I believe is Sarah and Candice, to introduce yourselves too. Sarah?
Hi, my name is Sarah Santillis. I'm in Idaho in the United States, and I started writing about violence in photography when I first saw the Abu Ghraib photographs of torture by American soldiers when I was a doctoral student, and they were being referred to as crucifixion images, and I wanted to understand what that Christian narrative of salvific violence was doing when imposed on the bodies of tortured many Muslim men. So that started me thinking about photography and ethics and violence and what our responsibility is as viewers, as people looking at these images. And I've been keeping a casual screenshot data bank of American media images of dead bodies and suffering bodies. And we don't show images in our country of white dead bodies. We only show images of Black and brown bodies. And that's what I've been writing about recently. And I wrote a lot about images in photography and what difference images might make in my book called Draw Your Weapons.
Candice?
Yes, I'm Candice Janssen, and yeah, I write in photography, and my interest in photography is very much historical. And so I really think about these questions of ethics and structural violence that we're kind of locating in the contemporary, and I think about what that means for the archive. And these images are now being archived, right? They're becoming part of our visual history. And so in that sense, we are continuing a particular kind of violence. But then we also think about how these kind of contemporary art images are also in a way displacing critical underserved histories in photography, in fact, because these artists are being collected. But at the same time, there's also a particular kind of ethical question that also emerges around collections of photography that are also being bought up by institutions that are also displaying certain kinds of predatory behaviors around collections that should be located here in Africa, for instance. And so, yeah, so I think the set of questions people are raising for me, I'm definitely locating within the politics of the archive and memory, that from the position where I'm sitting in South Africa, we're in a crisis right now with, for instance, our Black photographers that are, whose archives are being vulnerable to these archival predators, we call them, but also that are not being preserved. So I think this ethical and structural question is also a question of archival preservation, not just image production.
Yeah, I was thinking about that a lot, Candice, because we've recently seen some very bizarre cases where because the archives are not protected, so-called, art photographers have come and taken images from the archives and then kind of worked with those images, like colored them over, moved things around a bit, and then presented those images as their own work, because they're very powerful work from the 1980s especially, and said, this is my artistic photograph. And then it just so happened by accident that one of the photographers who took the original image that was then doctored up, for instance, walked by that doctored up image and being sold for, of course, tens of thousands of dollars at an art fair. And he was like, that's my photograph, what the hell? And then there was a whole discussion about who owns the photograph. Can I comment on it by visually overlapping it with my own kind of play on that image? And so that means that a lot of the work is not protected. And then sometimes if the photographer is a privileged person, they've sent their archives away or given their archives to a university, say in the US, which means that people, students, the public in South Africa don't have access to it. So I was wondering if you could kind of speak about also how memory is being made also in South Africa through those image repertoires, that who gets to be archived and who doesn't. And this is true of all kind of African photographic centers.
Of course, and even though the South African historic photographic situation is in crisis, we have to acknowledge that unfortunately we are in a much more privileged position than many other African countries, which is obviously quite difficult. But I think, yeah, I mean, it's an ongoing question around the tension, I think, between heritage and memory, because I think the idea of heritage and archive is also bound up in all sorts of colonial ideas about ethnicity, national borders, language categories that are in fact continuing a particular kind of erasure in the absence of work that's being done around memory and community memory that becomes really important to kind of bring photography into the realm of ordinary life and documenting people's histories that do not form part of national narratives. So I think photography is really stuck in that bind between the kind of nationalist imperative around national memory and what communities' hunger really is for memory.
Yeah, I mean, you know, like I think part of what's happening is that those images are so well known that a certain kind of dominant narrative is curated, and then the others that may have an argument with that dominant narrative are just sort of discarded. That means that a lot of history, a lot of people's history is not being told. So you end up with this very kind of heteropatriarchal narrative of a lot of countries' stories, especially in South Africa, we see that a lot. So Ben, I realized that you haven't really introduced yourself. So I'm wondering if you could introduce yourself and then talk a little bit about your work as well.
Yeah, okay. Hi, I'm Benjamin. I have a little company called Duck Rabbit, predominantly a filmmaker. I was just thinking of what Asim said when he was talking while the internet booted you out of the room, Neelika. The idea of just, he said he was being asked to go to Pakistan and basically just make things up. I was at the BBC for a long time as a radio documentary producer, and I started in Liverpool. I started while I was basically living in a cafe, a very bohemian lifestyle, and I used to record the stories of people who would come into the cafe. And so my whole sort of formative years of my career was about, I would take people's stories, I'd take my own voice out and put them into a narrative and put them on the radio. And it became the idea of representing somebody, the person in front of you, that idea of trust, that they give something of themselves and you give something of yourself in taking their story and giving it to the world, is very precious and very, very important. It's a bond of trust. And if you break that trust, it's like a wound of the soul. It would be for me. And so I became particularly interested after I left the BBC. I went to live in Ethiopia. I had to re-educate, my mind about racist ways of thinking, and I'm quite happy to talk about that and get into it. And it's very problematic for people like myself. But when I started getting into photography, it was just so obvious that it was just making it up, and that these representations were so unfair. And I hope we're going to talk about this, and so poor. And the only benefit seemed to be for the people taking the pictures. And yet the people on the other side of the pictures are some of the most vulnerable people in the world. And it's our role and responsibility as human beings to care about other human beings. And this really, really disturbed me. And it's part of a problem of photography itself as a medium, because it's very difficult to have a reply to it. And because it does remove the voice. When you hear somebody's voice and you hear their story, it's very humanizing, or it can be. And photography does have an inherent problem. That's why the work of Asim, when he was a photographer, was so important what he was doing in Pakistan. He was taking the voices, but integral to that, and telling the stories of how what we were doing was affecting people in Pakistan when we were sending drones to bomb them, paid with my, taxpayers' money. But he was collecting their stories and very, very carefully writing them down. So you've got that picture, you've got the human shot beautifully, and you've got the story. And so when we talk about representation and the importance of that, is if we don't get it wrong, we're really, really hurting people. Like when we talk about violence, it's very real. I have a very personal childhood story, a very traumatic childhood story. And the idea of somebody taking that story and misrepresenting it is so deeply painful. But why then have we enabled ourselves to not see the people in the pictures as human beings, that we think it's okay to do that? Because it's not, and it can't be. And so I guess that's why I started writing about photography, and occasionally quite angrily. Even today I got angry when I saw something, and so I try not to, actually. And I guess that's basically where I'm coming from.
Yeah, Ben, I was thinking about the fact that you've been identifying and documenting instances in which photographers have been abusing their positions for decades, and when institutions have been instrumental to advancing those predatory photographers and their work. And by institutions, I don't want to also let off the hook individuals in those institutions who are very much instrumental to that practice and for ongoing practices of violence like that. So it's just that they happen to be institutions in their own right because they're that powerful in some ways, those individuals. And there's a couple of recent horror shows that I can think of immediately, and I wanted to ask you about the work you've been doing with particular cases.
Oh, there's so many.
There's so many.
I mean, Magnum Photos just took their whole archive offline for 2 weeks, or more than 2 weeks. Their whole archive offline. It's come back with all their tag words removed, because you've had women tagged with the word vagina. You've had girls tagged with the word prostitute. You've had a child getting off a toilet tagged with the word vulva. Okay, so, and all of these images have been produced. There's no journalistic value to them whatsoever, none at all. This is part of and generally when we're talking about the other, okay, and I speak that as a white middle-aged man, the benefactor of this whole system, right? Obviously, those are almost always brown and black bodies, not always, but almost always, especially when you see children and we label them prostitutes. How vile is that? How vile is it to out a child as a prostitute? What kind of person would do that for profit and money? And then we celebrate them and put them on a pedestal. I mean, this is as vile, and and of course, once you burst that bubble a bit and it goes outside of that little world, whether it's Magnum or, anyone, and anybody with a brain looking at it goes, hang on a minute, what? You were there with your camera when police were arresting children, little boys who've been forced into prostitution. It's not prostitution, obviously, it can't be, it's rape. And you're there taking pictures, and fully, you see a child crying because he's traumatized, because the police are arresting him, because he's a little boy who needs to be loved and looked after. And you're taking pictures, and now you're selling them. You're allowing people to download them, fully identifiable children. And now you're selling them for profit. Now, what kind of system is this that allows us to do this? This is, and this is what we're talking about, racism and structural racism, and nobody with a care for children or justice, how can you not argue against dismantling that whole thing and saying, why did we celebrate this? What kind of madness did we allow ourselves to I mean, it's all to do with the human brain and the fact that we don't think things through. We, you know, it's a wonderful book, Daniel Kahneman, Thinking Fast and Slow. We just see an image and we make a decision immediately, and almost everybody does that. But some of us are socialized into thinking in certain ways, and others of us aren't. And I think, you know, so that's what I'm interested in. How do you dismantle that whole system? Because it needs to happen. And why do we accept this? Why do we accept these practices when it's not me, when it's not my children, when it's not a white person, when it's the other? Why do we accept that? And why can't we have the conversation about racism then, when it's so obvious? Why do we have to wait for people to be murdered on camera over 7 or 8 minutes? It's really, really tragic, because it's stopping us, you know, it's just stopping so much good exchanges between people, and honesty and integrity, but also it's damaging the way that people look out in the world and they judge people. I don't have that problem, but I know, I'll just finish very, very quickly. My parents decided I was a demon child, right? They decided I was demonic. I was brought up in religious rites, and they would tell everybody, oh, Benjamin, he's got demons, he's a demon child. You might start to believe it if I start ranting. And then everywhere you'd go in the Christian thing, there'd be Ben, there's Ben, and ooh, his parents have told him. Now, that's what it's like, you know, when people see you and they layer something on you because of the way you look or the way you've been told. And photography, particularly towards Black and brown people, has done that. But it's only done that as part of the system. You know, we shouldn't see it specifically photography. It's just part of the mass of everything. But that has real world consequences. So I do think that it's not good enough to say, okay, here's my black square. You know, I'm Magnum. We've had one black, you know, member in 70 years, but now we're all, you know, Black Lives Matter. It's not good enough to that. We have to, you know, individually and institutionally recognize our failings, recognize our limitations just as human beings. Psychologically, it's very well documented, and then we have to do something about it. But yeah, sorry.
No, it's okay. I mean, I think you're talking about taking concrete actions rather than, you know, the performative activism that we're talking about, and having token kind of activism by hiring one person or you know, nominating one photographer to your group who is Black or brown or whatever. And I think, you know, Sarah, you've talked a lot about how underneath this, which we don't want to acknowledge often, is white supremacist ideology. And so I wanted to kind of ask you about that, and also the fact that you've talked about how there's such shifty, slippery work that photography and the attendant visibility that photography can provide an individual or a community. And at the same time, you know, you've written that whilst it provides visibility, it's a dangerous thing, photography, sometimes being seen, being looked at, signals value, importance, rank, yet at other times being seen or being watched signals objectification, victimization, being stripped of dignity. Racism renders Black and brown bodies simultaneously hypervisible and invisible. And maybe amongst us, we know this, but I don't think a larger public necessarily does. And these are conversations I'm having with my students who are walking into this kind of conversation too. So I wanted to first ask you about that slippery work that images do, but also about the, let's name it, it is white supremacy. It's, we can call it racism, but I think often racism kind of puts white supremacy underneath. And I want to actually expose that as white supremacy at work.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I mean, I think that white supremacy, part of what it carries with it is is privacy. It's the privilege of not having your body seen at its most vulnerable. And nobody seems to be talking about that in the United States in the media. You know, I started paying attention to the torture photographs, and then I was teaching a lot of university classes on ethics and aesthetics and images of war, and keeping like a literal tally, like whose bodies are in in the news, who gets a name, whose body is seen and how, and whose aren't seen. And starting to say that the images that we see, you can only consider them when you're considering alongside the images that we don't see. So for example, in the United States, we also don't see American soldiers killed in war. That was illegal to be in the media. Even their caskets, we weren't allowed to see, like flag draped caskets, we weren't allowed to see. And so in my classes, we would talk about whiteness, that white supremacy hides some bodies from view and makes other bodies visible. But really what I thought it was at first was Americanness, that it was somehow being from the United States that protected your body. And then I saw the body of Michael Brown on the front page of the New York Times, his uncovered body on the front page of the New York Times. And I thought, well, it's not Americanness, you know, Michael Brown is American. Why is it that we are able to see freely and without restriction images of police murdering Black people, Black and brown people in the United States, videos of them, photographs of them, on Instagram, on any social media, on every single major media outlet? Why are we allowed to see those images, but we cannot see images of dead white people? We don't see American students, for example, white students killed by gun violence in schools. We don't see American soldiers killed by war. So what is happening, and how do these images support white supremacy and racism, even though the rhetoric is the opposite? The rhetoric is that by somehow seeing these images, these murder films, these films of murder, somehow white America will wake up and do something about racism. But when you only see Black and brown bodies, and other people are allowed privacy, which I think the only explanation is white supremacy. I can't see that there's any other explanation. Then it's impossible to look at those without playing into the very narratives that they're said to be disrupting. And I don't understand why this isn't a more dominant conversation in American media. I don't see any other way to explain it except for white supremacy.
Yeah. Anybody else want to jump in?
Can I just make a comment there? I think there's a very interesting contradiction, just touching on your point, Sarah, about the bodies we can see and not see. Because one of the things obviously we have to recognize is a lot of the Black bodies that we're seeing are, of course, because of access to phone cameras. Mm-hmm. So it's the evidence of these crimes is not coming from journalism, and it's not coming from, it's basically the public that has forced journalists to take account. A very good example of this was, again, what happened at Standing Rock, which was going on for months before mainstream journalists arrived, and that also after Amy Goodman arrived, and that also when the news became about repression, but you know, who was covering Standing Rock. And the other thing which could be interesting to think about is something that I've mentioned a few times on my blog, is the fact that the Americans have, since 2001, been involved in a number of illegal wars that have murdered over a million people and displaced many millions more, and all those bodies are missing. Mm-hmm. And in fact, the question that I've asked my community, or my so-called community of photojournalists, is that why hasn't a single photographer done a long-term project on Iraq or on Afghanistan or on Libya or any one of these places to document sort of the aftermath of American invasions and illegal occupations? In fact, no one's done anything. Mm-hmm. And then when the bodies turn up, they're just the migrants being washed up on our shores. Yep. The bodies invading good Europe, the bodies, you know, looking to destroy our good societies, those ugly Syrians and those bizarre Afghanis who no one can seem to understand why they're coming to our shores. So there's this strange habit where bodies are appearing and they're forcing themselves into our consciousness, but the question to ask is, how are they arriving? Even Abu Ghraib was leaked documents. It wasn't journalists, and in fact, I think most of the Abu Ghraib photographs we haven't even seen because they stopped them from being released. Yes. So there's this, there are these bodies washing into the shores of our consciousness. Mm-hmm. And it's very interesting to question where they're coming from, and kind of the way mainstream, again, I can only speak about mainstream media, how it's forced to react, mm-hmm. as opposed to taking responsibility to speak about these lives as worthy of concern and consideration and so on. So
there's two things I want to go towards as we near the end of the hour. One of them is to ask Candace about the fact you've said, you've mentioned that lineages of visual power are sustained by the myth that Black lives are absent from the archive and compounded by our photographic definitions of what a photographer is or what photography is, you know? And it made me think about something Asim had been writing about and spoke about when we were preparing for this dialogue, that you were speaking about the embedded program after 2001, you know, like how it created a certain kind of archive that showed the soldier, the US soldier, the British soldier, the Allied forces soldier, and the narratives were always in that point of view. And it's very rare that when a newspaper cites how many are dead, it's usually about the number of American troops who've died. Never. It's very, very rare. There are instances when that happens, or I will say it in class. And I'll cite some kind of newspaper that's reputable enough that people, my students, will know and show that. And so it's both in the archive as well as in our current repertoire of images where there's these large absences, and they do determine how we think about our political world and about our personal lives as well, like how we interrelate to each other. So I wanted to kind of put that on the table and see what the two of you might say about it, and what kind of fruitful conversation we could come to as we come towards a close.
Well, I don't want to open a different can of worms, because in some senses, because that is a whole nother can of worms, but in some sense, I wanted to ask Benjamin, or maybe even to the group, because I think this kind of visual activism that you're doing is so important. But my fear about it at this point is that everyone is now going to their archives and they're destroying, they're cleaning themselves up. And now they're doing massive, like we have a whole new archive, like, you know, after these regime changes, all these archives get destroyed. That's currently happening. These institutions are now going to the archives and then cleaning themselves up. And now I wonder then what happens then? How does that visual activism now have to shift in a sense, because people are going and sanitizing themselves?
That's a brilliant question. What do you think?
I don't know, because I'm sitting with some images myself, and I wonder, do I want to write about it? Do I want to let people know about it? But I'm scared to do that, because immediately institutions and people retract, and people—
They know, they're watching. You know, I'm getting my Twitter, I know, because I've just been told yesterday, screen grabbed on a daily basis by a major photography institution, because their crisis comms person told a journalist that that's exactly what was happening. So they'll get me a little bit worried about what I might write on Twitter. It's extraordinary, but, you know, I think the truth is, if you is on your side, but there is a big cleanup. A huge cleanup, and they're profound. Some of the stuff is profoundly disturbing, like profoundly disturbing. Some of it does need proper investigation. And some of it, we know in the UK, for example, there's a history of covering up. If you look at the church and child abuse, you look at or any institutions, and the same will have happened in photography institutions. We know that. So I think, but it shouldn't be, I think the question is, Candice, it shouldn't be down to people like me. Like, it's ridiculous. It's absurd. It shouldn't be down to me to go, okay, what's this doing on the archive? But exactly as the good thing is you've got the Wayback Machine. So some of the photos that I know have been taken off the archive, I have quite a lot of copies of them, and they've been passed on. So yeah, it's such a great question.
No,
But most of it, just to say, final point, is most of it is all in plain sight. I'll just give you very quickly the best example for me was when Vanashi, the Argentinian Italian photographer, was funded by the Pulitzer Center on Crisis Reporting to do a project on child witchcraft. Oh my God, you couldn't make it up, right? It had to be witchcraft in Uganda. And he'd done a series of photo projects which are really bad. They won lots of awards, and one of them had been very well debunked by a photographer in Africa who works and lives in Africa. Debunked it brilliantly, and nobody paid any attention. And then he went to a woman in the dead of night whose child had been mutilated and murdered, arm chopped off. If you believe, you should never believe necessarily what you read, but if you believe it. But anyway, he went in the dead of the night. And then he paid the woman and the elder, and they dug up the body, the child's body, right? They dug up the body and he took a photograph, right? And then he published his account on the Pulitzer Center's blog. And nobody said, everyone thought this is great journalism. Wow. He went to Uganda. He went in the dead of night. He had a body dug up, poor guy. He paid the money, he took photos. They even showed the photo. Nobody said, oh my God, what are you doing? Have you completely lost the plot? Because that's a crime scene, that child. You know, the police will come and if they need to, the forensics, they will do, you know, so you can't be paying a woman. You went to a traumatized woman, but everyone. And so I did ask a few questions about it. It must have been up for a long, long time before they suddenly decided, well, maybe we should take this picture down because, you know, is it right to go in the middle of the night and ask a grieving mum if you can dig their child up and take a photograph? A few days later, the director of the center, John Sawyer, said, okay, he did a naughty thing. He probably shouldn't have done it, but we're going to continue to support this project. We're going to continue to support this act of violence. And of course they didn't, because at that point it was done. But they would never say, no, you know, this has got to stop. Actually, this has all gone too far. We're in crazy land now. We're in absolute madness, where we've got this idea of ourselves as journalists who can basically have the right to do anything. So most of the time, like, the questions have started to be asked and they're catching up with the images, which will mean a total reevaluation of the canon. It will mean saying, well, actually, was this photographer a good journalist, or did he take these very aesthetic photographs that lead us to think of Africans as something that they're really not? And that's bad journalism, right? But it goes beyond that. It's toxic. So even if we were just to deal with what's in the plain sight, it would take a long, long time. And it will probably be the next generations, won't they? Will come up and go, you know, fuck this shit. Excuse my language, but we're not doing this anymore. We're not selling, you know, and that's what's happened. Actually, that's the brilliant thing. I think that's the positive for me.
Then what happened around the kind of early to mid 2000s was that so many people from Kenya, Nigeria, South Africa were getting access to the internet and would create noise about it. Brilliant. And this was the very first kind of experience for, say, the New York Times photo editor to have even, say, people from Kenya getting on Twitter to protest the fact that, and say, this is not okay, you need to fire this photo editor, which was just a couple of years back. Why have you published photographs of somebody who is clearly being killed by a terror attack? And why have you published this person in death? Their family may not even know yet. And it had to become a weeks-long kind of sustained activist kind of work before those photographs were in fact taken down. And then that photo editor was not fired, but just moved, I think, to Britain. And then a different photo editor was like quietly brought in. And I was talking to a couple of my friends who were the people who were doing the sustained kind of work on Twitter and on media, social media and other ways too. And they said that, in a way that is a victory, but she does get to keep her job still. She may move on, and she in fact goes to Britain and sort of like build her career on the subjectivity of, Africans as people who continue to be imaged in the same way. But photo editors make that decision. It was in fact a prize-winning African-born photographer who took those images as he walked in. But that is a photo editor who makes that decision. And so those images have a long lineage. And yeah, I'm wondering about that, Candice, because if you remove them, that means that we don't have a body of work to point to, even as we speak about this. There's a lot of vacuuming up that's going on right now. So yeah, speaking about it ends up with a lot of erasures too. It's not just the people who and their subjectivities and their powerful voices that are being erased and replaced with kind of Heart of Darkness or Orientalist images, but it's the evidence of that body of work too that's being removed. And yeah, Asim, I was thinking that embedded journalism did a fantastic job.
I mean, both Candice and Ben sort of led into this because we always tend to speak about individual photographers, but I think we should be speaking about institutions that enable these kinds of practices, celebrate them, and then publish them. Speaking about, I mean, embedded photography, photojournalism, I think, yes, we critiqued, and a lot of people critiqued embedded photography, how it was censorship and so on. But I think a lot of people didn't understand or realize how embedded photography was whitewashed into journalism. The fact that if, for example, you were a Russian photographer embedded with Russian forces invading the Crimea and sending out photographs, I doubt if any editor would have taken those images to be for journalism. But it was institutions around embedded photography around the entire, which allowed what were basically censored photographs emerging from America's wars to be laundered in a way to become journalism. And these institutions included World Press Photo, which started awarding photographers who were clearly embedded and producing works from within embedded spaces of American soldiers. So 100,000 Afghanis can die, but the World Press Photo is of a sleeping American soldier, this benign, innocent, white American, in fact, I remember Gary Knight said it was a photograph that represented the exhaustion of a nation at war, which was actually hilarious given that, America in 2007, our budgets were like going up, like there was no tomorrow and we were getting ready for more war. But you could see how these authoritative institutions, World Press Photo, Frontline Club, Oscars, right? We had Tim Hetherington and Sebastian Junger's film, Restropo was shortlisted at the Oscars in documentary. This was a film that produced purely embedded with American forces in Afghanistan. No questions were raised. So, ICP this is one of the most influential photography institutions in the world, handing out awards to photographers who, in the middle of the American occupation, are being celebrated for the war, for their work done during the Soviet occupation. Suddenly, everyone goes deaf to the present moment. So I think institutions have a big role to play here in terms of the kinds of things that they allow and they enable, because in the end, it is possible in a world for, say, an American photographer to take photographs of small children, send them back to the agency, and the agency to refuse and say, hey, this is outrageous. This is not work. This is not serious. This is not something we are going to accept. And we are not going to allow you to work in this fashion. Or a magazine can say that, an editor can say that. But that pushback doesn't come, which sort of draws me to something that I think Candice was starting to, and also Sarah touched on, which is this idea of that somehow in journalism, or photojournalism, there's this idea of manufacturing difference. I think this is one of the things that racism plays with, right? We read a lot about how capitalism relies on racial and gender differences and how it exploits bodies by sort of defining its hierarchy. And I'm thinking of Cedric Robinson and so on. You're always looking to create difference, right? You're always going out into the world and finding ways of sort of depicting it where it's titillating, exciting, where it's not us, right? Not us liberal, not us democratic, not us gender equal, not us free speech loving. You go out and you find these sensationalist, hysterical stories that magazines love to publish, right? Because you can show people doing weird and strange things, and you were always able to take liberties with other bodies, whether that was under slavery, whether that was under colonialism, whether that was under law, whether that was under liberalism. You could always take liberties. I mean, what was liberalism? Liberalism never applied to the non-European, to the non-white. The international laws didn't apply. There were certain democracies for Europe and this other thing for the colonies. And so I think we see a lot of these sort of continuities of discourses and frames, which, you know, allow, I feel that journalists who are, like, for example, like I still find it interesting that we are still doing, or white South African photographers think or unthinkingly will launch into a project about Black male sexuality. Now, I really do feel that if you're a white South African photographer, you have an ethical, moral responsibility to know your history and the history of your region and the history in how Black bodies have been represented, or depictions of deviant Black sexuality or Black violence against women has been used. You can't just ignorantly walk into the Congo and start taking photographs and launch a project. I'm not going to take the name of the photographer who did this, but there is a photographer doing this, and he was celebrated. And it's a whole project about Black male masculinity. And this is right out of like the 90s, like you see this project description and you kind of catch your breath thinking, my God, the gall of this thing. I mean, let's go even more recent. You had Lindsay Adario photographing a naked, pregnant African woman for the cover of Time magazine, using the same aesthetic tropes that colonialists and pseudoscientists like anthropologists use when they were measuring and calculating the, you know, Black bodies. And she does this now, like I think it was like 2 or 3 years ago. And you do this in this incredible space of white privilege where you just don't need to have any sense of your historical baggage and responsibility. You can just sort of traipse in, tell this woman to get naked, strip, put her sideways like you're an anthropologist, and Time magazine can run it as a cover photo, and then you can say it was being done for her benefit. So a few hundred people have been involved in this process, not just one photographer, just from the moment the image was commissioned, setting it up, shooting it, bringing it back to the US, arranging it, and the awards, the accolades, how everybody thought it was so beautiful. And it's the same sense of moral, ethical difference of the other that you can play with, that you would never attempt to do something like that.
I want to try to move towards closing some remarks before we get to some of the questions people have posed to us. And Sarah, I was thinking about the things you talked about, that there are some ways out of this, and there needs to be ways that we have to kind of concretely address, that there are things we can do, not just as individuals, but as institutions, because I don't believe in just putting it on the shoulders of individuals to do anything when institutions control so much of how people see things and what people see, and also how we then go on to photograph ourselves. It's a classic thing in literature that there was even a really wonderful book of criticism written in the, I think, early 90s called Snow on the Cane Fields, about a Caribbean writer who and theorist who wrote about how growing up, for instance, that she didn't know anything but to write about snow, because that's really how all the books she read were, British novelists. And though she grew up in a cane field, or with a cane field nearby, this is the way you too reproduce the vision of your world, the narrative of your world, the view of your world, because this is the only narrative that's been fed to you. And so you've spoken about the kind of responsibility we can take on as individuals. And we can start from there, but I think I want to also talk about institutional responsibility. And then Ben, you know, you teach, you run a photography program. Candace, you teach at an institution that is one of the most amazing kind of programs that is outside of a university in South Africa. And Asim, you're doing a PhD, which obviously means maybe, hopefully, you will end up teaching. So as educators, as people running photo programs in and out of institutions, or, you know, educational institutions that are like universities, what can we do? And I want to begin with Sarah, because I know you've written extensively about this.
Well, now that everyone's talked, I'm thinking a lot more about institutions. I've written a lot about like what viewers can do ethically. I like The Civil Contract of Photography by Ariella Azoulay. I think there's really fascinating arguments that when you see a photograph of someone in pain, you become a citizen of that world with that person and obligated morally to do something to stop the violence that you see. So I've been paying a lot of attention to those questions. How do we become better viewers? How do we become accountable for what we see? How do we let photographs make a difference and turn emotional responses into concrete political action? You know, I think we've been trained to think that viewing a picture means having an emotional response, but that actually does nothing for no one. It doesn't do anything for anyone. It's better to be able to act politically and commit yourself to ending other violence like that if you have arrived too late, which most of us have arrived. When we see a picture, it's too late. But one of the things I've been thinking while I've been listening to all of these ideas here is about drones. You know, the United States have been using weaponized cameras to kill other people. And I think that drones, I became obsessed with drones for about 4 years, thinking about what does it mean to attach missiles to images, and how is all of our viewing, how does the way that we've been taught to look, at least the way I've been taught as a white American woman, to look at images of other people in pain, how am I like a drone? How are my eyes like a gun? And how might we sever the relationship between misseeing and thinking that we know anything about anyone else, and that our misseeing is all we need to justify killing another person, whether that's the slow violence of poverty or the quick violence of war. So for me, I'd like to think about how institutions and individuals can sever the relationship between the camera and the gun. What might that look like? That's just my thought today after listening to everyone else share their ideas.
Candace and Asim and Ben?
Yeah, I think for me, it's just still coming back to the point that the question of ethics and structural violence is not just about what's depicted in an image, but it's also about how it's collected, how it's distributed, and how it's archived. And so I don't teach at the Market Photo Workshop, by the way, but I do run our public programs, and I think really what we are encouraging photographers to do is to not just be concerned about image production, but also be thinking about themselves as knowledge producers. So becoming very much archivally conscious about what it is that they're doing and what it is that they're producing. And also we are trying to build this archival consciousness also across generations. So who are we teaching to our photographers becomes a really, really important question. We are having a much stronger, and have been for the last few years, a strong Pan-African focus around our visual culture that we are teaching students to become far more conscious of, and to see their work as being part of a larger kind of a Pan-African archive in a sense. So, and also for them to become very conscious about their relationship with institutions. And again, thinking of themselves as knowledge producers, as having archives, how are they going to be mediating their relationship with these institutions that have their own particular agendas around showing their work, buying their work, and empowering photographers to be able to make those kinds of decisions, thinking about their work historically, but also politically, is really, really, really important.
So I think what I I think there's a lot to be learned. So we're teaching workshops on our side. And as some of you may know, I'm part of a humanities collective called Polis that I run with Chitra out of New York, where we've been doing new kinds of workshops and so on. But one of the most exciting things for me has been actually to learn from people who are actually doing something different. And what I have found, which I think a lot of people are not paying attention to, is that there's this amazing sort of kind of work. And again, here I'm speaking about journalism and so on. This amazing work which is emerging out of indigenous communities. If you look at the North American, Native American communities in Canada and the US, they're not asking for inclusion to mainstream media. They're not asking to be let in. They're building their own journalism ecosystems. They are working from within their communities, and the work that they're producing is, fundamentally different, because unlike Western journalism or white journalism, which hides its histories in colonialism and racism and violence and war, one of the privileges of being a Native American journalist is that they speak through and from these realities, and they're located and situated. They understand their own histories as located in colonialism, located in racism. And I think that these alternative sort of these ecosystems are really where we should be looking and studying them and actually engaging with them more. You see some of the elements of this in India where Dalit Camera is trying to do the same, where it recognizes that it doesn't, if it just fights for inclusion in mainstream spaces, it's kind of wasting its time. And they're putting together their own eco spaces for speaking, from within their communities, about their communities, and sort of bringing the major issues of their time through in a way that matter to those communities. And I think these are really exciting spaces to, that give. I mean, it would be very easy for me to throw up my hands and say, oh my God, the New York Times is a wall I'm never going to defeat. But I'm not interested in that anymore. I think what I'm interested in is that we finally have it. I mean, Ben has his own, in a way, his own space where he does his own work, and other people are creating these spaces. We see this in American media. I think, there are more individual channels online, people producing all sorts of very interesting new work. I think photography, for various reasons, hasn't been as experimental, though I don't see why. It's still very married to the worship of National Geographic and New York Times and these brands and winning World Press Photo and all that kind of nonsense. But hopefully a new generation of photographers will realize that you have to kind of walk away from these spaces. I mean, people are now walking away from National Geographic, even though it's now owned by Rupert Murdoch. So, here are a bunch of people saying, oh, we are not Trump, we stand against Trump, and they're happily turning up at Nat Geo magazine to shoot assignments. It's kind of like this mental block. So I think there's a lot of new stuff happening. It's happening kind of at the edges. And I think we have to be humble enough to leave the New York Times people aside, to leave National Geographic aside, and go to South Dakota, go to the Native communities, go to the Native American Journalism Association, and learn a thing or two about how do you work with people in a way that respects their histories and that respects the way you see the world from the margins. And you produce work for them, not for the advertisers. You produce work for them. And I think these are the things that we have to now educate and talk about more than, and in some ways let the times be in some ways,
Last word, Ben, and then we'll go
to... I just agree with what's been said, particularly talking about teaching Asim and Candice and the idea of walking away from certain things and not feeling that's the pinnacle of being, because you end up on the other side of that and you might not like what you've done, and that's a dangerous place to be. But I think what I would say is, I think Candice was speaking to this, is young people are coming in far more enlightened than I am in lots of ways. I have two kids. And they're much more switched on about lots of things, particularly around sexuality and gender and all kinds of things that I'm like well behind the curve on in lots of ways. So I think that's incredibly encouraging when you teach a group of young people. They look at things critically and they can see shit for what it is. Mostly always, in my experience, and that's brilliant. You're just teaching critical thinking to an extent. And I agree that the most important thing is when I make a film with someone, they're the first person who gets to see it. I send it off to them in most cases when I can. And then I'm waiting, I'm holding my breath. How do they feel about the way I've represented them? And that's what you're talking to, Asim, to an extent. The humility of understanding as us as collaborators in this world of other people's stories and how precious those things are, and treading more carefully and caring about them more than these institutions, or going up the ladder in these institutions, which ultimately might, as I say, not lead you to being the most wonderfully happy person. Not that that's the aim necessarily in life. So, you know, I can be broadly positive, and mostly I stopped writing about these things, the problematic stuff, because it's exhausting and it doesn't really lead anywhere. And so, you know, you can just be angry and fighting against it, but change won't really happen. You know, some things get taken down, maybe if you know, maybe some new policy, etc., etc. I think it's just you know, that's like an endless pursuit, but there's a lot of positive stuff you can do. Blah, blah, blah. Sorry.
It's okay. I know that there is a lot of fatigue to this work.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. It's.
But again, like I think that's as Sarah also pointed out. I mean, the shift is happening. Yes. Outside. So these pressures are coming, and it's not. I mean, this is how these big institutions will change. They're not going to do it from within. We're not going to educate the towards intelligence. It's the fact that we have to be more comfortable staying outside and recognizing that we create our own spaces, and those spaces are going to force, you know, and there will be some unfortunate things like Candice pointed out. They're going to hide the archive. But you know what? I just feel maybe that's let them do that. Maybe that's better than leaving it open, and there's a new generation that realizes not to create that archive in the first place. And, you know, fucking burn that archive, you know, burn this shit, or burn the sensibility that allowed you to exploit young girls and take photographs and come back and say that was journalism. You know, I think the shift is happening, and it's a moment, you know, where, yeah, as Ben said, we step away. It's coming from the community. These shifts are taking place. You know, the forces are not in our institutions or in our sort of professional spaces anymore, which is very exciting. So.
They get worried. They shit themselves. You know, don't think they're sitting there, you know, in the Magnum offices going, oh my God, what's going on? How did we do this? How have we been selling this stuff? It's a nightmare for them. And that's why being in those spaces, when they've been doing really, really dumb things for lots of years, is not a great place to be. That's not a great community. That's not something you really want to be a part of. There's lots of exciting other spaces that you can, you know, and stories to tell. So many stories to tell.
So with that, I want to segue into questions, and Amy is back to help us kind of direct us towards some of the questions that have been posed to us.
Sure. So one of our first questions is from Denise, who asks, could you all maybe speak to some role models of photographers or artists you feel are sensitive to the politics of representation and are ethically responsible in their practice and work? And I guess that's to everyone.
I can go immediately. I can tell you that if you look at the work of American photographer LaToya Ruby Fraser, I think her work is absolutely the kind of work that one wants to produce, particularly her work, which is, I forget the name of the book that she did with her mother. She's a fantastic example of someone who's working. Obviously, she's working in her own community, but more importantly, she's working on issues which are not just about herself. So she's speaking about broad issues of capitalism. She's speaking about neoliberal practices, and I think it's a fantastic example of kind of engaged intellectual and visual work that we should be pushing people to produce.
There's also Eric Gianti in Ghana, and a whole number of others from the African continent, which we could list off, and maybe I should ask Candice quickly too. Yeah, Carrie Mae Weems.
Carrie Mae Weems.
Yeah, there's too many. There's too many. I don't actually want to mention some because
one over the other. Yeah.
I don't want to single out.
And I think about the fact that a lot of it is the really fine, wonderful work is being done within communities that the photographers know really well, grew up in or are very close to. And it does not, I'm not saying that a white man cannot take a good or thoughtful and ethical photograph of somebody who does not belong to being white and male. That's not what I'm saying. Nobody is trying to censor white men. And so
You should.
people have, the last conversation I had that propelled me to do this series was because there were conversations in an organization on which I used to be a board member and subsequently resigned because they were not going to move forward with it. And this series, in fact, came to be because of that kind of conversation I was having, that I'm somehow going to be curtailing the freedom of white male photographers by saying this work is in the tradition of racist work, and somehow I'm preventing that work and that freedom. So there are, but that's really not what I'm saying. I'm saying that essentially that you need to actually know who you're photographing, or otherwise you are inevitably going to be, your work is going to be colored by the lens that you grew up with, maybe very unconsciously, and it's going to be painful for you to realize that you've been doing that work, and that lots of institutions, awards, newspapers, museums have supported you, and that's because those museums too are thinking through that lens. And so it's not enough to be like, well, but she's in X museum. But what about these awards? What about these residencies this photographer has had? Well, guess what? Guess who's on that selection committee? So yeah.
But I think the question is pointing out a bigger problem, in the sense is that it's hard. It's hard to actually know who or what kind of ways is it possible for people to understand what they're looking at, or how photographers are being packaged and presented to people. How do you make that evaluation if you're not kind of within the community and in these spaces? How do you make that kind of evaluation around, is this okay or is this not okay for me personally as a viewer? And I think that's a really, really difficult question, because often these projects around historic colonial archives, sometimes these projects are being often legitimated by writers and institutions and people who have certain kinds of legitimacy. So it becomes really difficult to make that kind of evaluation. Yeah.
I know, that was one of the things that I realized like very quickly, that as a writer and as a critic and a person who collaborates with artists, that my work was being was very much going to be directed towards validating that kind of work. And I had to like make some decisions about like, I don't want to accept this money because I don't want to be doing that. So there were financial repercussions. There were also like, you know, like the fact that you won't get opportunities because you've spoken up.
Right, 100%.
All the time. So you get shunted out of having a platform because you're critical of dominant ways of visualizing minoritized people or women or whatever.
I think it's also less, I want to, like, I can give an example of a white male photographer and a white writer who's produced a really beautiful body of work, which was what John Berger and Jean Moore produced, a little book called A Seventh Man. I think for me, it's always about how you enter a story and how you see other individuals as full human beings, people making decisions about life, and under some very trying circumstances, some decisions which we may not like, may not appreciate, but that we, even in our privileged spaces, would make the same decisions. I think this is what's beautiful about A Seventh Man, and is that it's these two men who are not immigrants to Europe, who are not Turkish backgrounds, can produce a body of work out of just being open-minded, listening closely, paying attention to details, and a sense of human sensitivity to understand how would they respond to these circumstances of employment in Germany and being away from your children, being away from your family. What does that feel like? And then using that feeling to write this really poetic book, which has stood the test of time. And you know, I think that book tells you more about migrants coming to Europe than any of the rubbish produced over the last 5 years about this migrant crisis stuff that people have been producing. You still have to go read A Seventh Man to understand what the dynamics of rebuilding Europe and capitalism and exploitation of labor, how all these different forces come into play. And this complexity, I think, is what really is the order of the day, right? This is what Ruby Fraser does with her work. It's a complex body of work. It's not just about Black victimhood or Black, it's bringing in layers of different social, political, economic, personal histories that overlap and influence each other. And that is what I think liberates us from simply saying, hey, only a Black person can do a story about Black Africa, go find me a Black photographer, like that initiative Magnum was part of in finding photographers of color in America. Just, just another embarrassing, shameless kind of auto-racializing effort they tried. But yeah, I mean.
Sarah, I think you were.
You had mentioned Fred Wilson, Sarah.
Actually, just thinking about him when Candace was talking about the erasure of archives and his Mining the Museum exhibition at the Baltimore Historic Society, and how he turned images against each other, like self-representation by Native Americans with racist representation, with the back turned toward the viewer, and they become in conversation. And I think we're having that conversation in the United States about taking down these racist monuments to Confederate people, and people saying it's an erasure, but actually it's revealing the original erasure of the violence of racism. And so maybe we need like multiple archives, like an archive of colonial racism alongside the destroyed archive as well. And I think Fred Wilson did that really. I think Mining the Museum is fascinating with his use of juxtaposition. It's how I want my writing to work, where you put things next to each other that aren't supposed to be next to each other to reveal violence and the history of the history of violence. Yeah.
Amy, I want to quickly move ahead to some other things, and then we can kind of go back to some questions too.
Sure. So we had a comment from Peter who says, hi, thanks for this important conversation. I think many of us who are critical of our own industry wrestle with the degree to which we should engage with existing institutions with very problematic histories, WPP, Nat Geo, long list, and work to improve them, versus the burn it down approach of walking away from those institutions and completely starting new endeavors. Wondering the panelists' thoughts. Thank you. I feel like this comment has been addressed in the conversation already, but yeah, if anyone has any thoughts.
Peter does some fantastic work himself. I think he started the Everyday projects on Instagram, so it's worth noting that. I do think you should take each institution individually and not think about them collectively. So I've written a lot about World Press Photo. I think it's very institutionally racist. I think it makes its money and profit from doing a tour of photographs that are very, very problematic, and its journalistic values are bankrupt. So, and I've written extensively about that, case after case after case. And I agree with Asim. I think some institutions should be gone. I don't, why would you want to save? Why would you want to? I don't understand why you would want to save something like that. But I think individually, people have to make their choices. People are rejecting it anyway now, massively, hugely. So I think that's in principle, a good thing. But you've got to take each. And it's too easy to sit here and judge individuals. It's hard in life, you've got to make a living. So it'd be easy for me to sit and criticize everyone, but you can see which institutions might be moving in one direction or not.
Yeah, I think
they also employ a lot of institutions like that, which have are very much continue to be imbricated in racist kind of practices, will reach out to small institutions in Africa, or to small photography collectives or whatever. So then, those less powerful organizations that are trying to train photographers in their own countries or in their own communities, inevitably, they're in many ways, like, how do you say no to such a powerful organization that only has like white people on their board and white people on their staff, and continue to make blah 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 blah, you know, like, so how do you say no to World Press Photo landing up at your door and saying, hey, would you come and help us judge our, you know, yearly whatever, because you're trying to also get exposure for your own organization and bring money to your organization for you to do the good work that you try to do. So these are like real life things that many institutions in African countries are dealing with. And I'm sure Candice can speak to that.
Of course. I mean, we are at the center of that kind of practice, and it's really difficult. It is really difficult as someone who is working within that institution. You have to then contend with those kinds of decisions and policies and certain kinds of directions. So it's a very difficult conversation, and I think part of how we are trying to deal with that, in a sense, is to make sure that in our conversations with our students, who it is important to understand global photojournalism in all its horror and fraughtness, that all of those images are properly contextualized, are properly politicized, so that it doesn't become just a PR exercise, but that our students are very much aware that these images have a complicated history, and they are being brought here to also educate us about what we shouldn't do, and that's also very important. So I think it's a difficult negotiation. Absolutely.
Yeah, I'm thinking of, you know, three amazing organizations like Ni Obadai in Ghana, in Accra, the Nest Collective in Nairobi, and Market Photo Workshop. And these are in Johannesburg, and these are long-term conversations we're all having about how to remain viable and negotiate that line as well. It isn't easy to do that. And maybe I should ask Amy for the next question.
Can I just make a quick comment on that last point, please?
Yeah,
yes.
To Peter's point, I think that a couple of quick things is, one, I don't think those two things are mutually exclusive, right? So we now have the opportunity to do our own work. And if you have the stomach to try to transform National Geographic or WordPress Photo, you are welcome to do that. What I will say, though, is it is naive to assume that what you're trying to transform is an institution. These institutions are embedded in a broader political economy. We can't pretend, for example, that National Geographic is a magazine that sits outside and away from Washington, DC, from Beltway, from its relationship to the politics of Murdoch, or the New York Times, whose editor goes public bragging about the fact that they're hardcore capitalists and they're never going to look otherwise. That what you're not trying to change is these very ideologies that are so destructive to the world outside of the US. So you're welcome to try that. But I think what I find most, in some ways, laughable about people who claim this is that very often people who are claiming to work for National Geographic, who know, or Time Magazine, who know that this is problematic, well, they're doing it because these institutions have power being money. They pay better, and they have the ability to overwhelm every other organization in their financial reach to get you to work for them, and subsequently get you to shut up because there's no other organization that's going to give you $150,000 to do an assignment. So we can't ignore these inequalities of power, which reflect inequalities of our world. They're not just, this is not a Ecuadorian magazine. There's a reason why this is an American magazine, or WordPress Photos in Europe. Ben mentioned, WordPress Photo is not an independent institution. It is largely run by people who come from media. It is very much influenced by monies from photo agencies and newspapers. And if you look at the juries and you look at who's sitting on the board, it's that same incestuous ecosystem of 20 people who are feeding each other, congratulating each other, and celebrating each other and each other's assigned photographers. So you can go and do this, but I think it's wrong to pretend or not understand the political economy of these institutions and where they sit. And then we can talk about what it is that you want to change and how you want to change it, and so on. I think this conversation just has to be pulled back and yeah, rather than I'll produce a grade 1 photo project that will make New York Times understand that not all Arabs are terrorists. You know, I mean, this is not even a starting conversation. So.
I think Candice is right, though. It's worse working in these institutions.
Yes.
I mean, really, it's worse. It's tougher and it's harder. And eventually you'll get spat out, and it will hurt a lot. But it's a challenging place to be, and we must respect people for that, who can do that for a while.
Yeah, we know who's there trying. We do. It's not easy for them. So Amy, back to you.
From Noah, he says, or they say, thank you so much for this conversation. I am co-founder of a group called Center Blackness Now concerning anti-Blackness at the International Center of Photography, and I'm deeply concerned about the ethics issues you are discussing. My main question is, what responsibilities do you think institutions of the same ilk as ICP have to help define photographic or photographic journalistic ethics?
First of all, hi Noah. I know you from Twitter, I think, and I'm really amazed by your work, and it is not an easy path to take to openly critique the ICP. So commendations, support, and please reach out anytime.
I think, sorry, Sarah, please.
Oh, thanks, Benjamin. I think it's interesting, like, it's not that the ethics need to be invented. They exist. You know, I wrote an article for the New York Times about racist photography practices and only showing Black and brown bodies that people tweet back at the New York Times when they show more Black and brown bodies in racist ways. So I don't think the ethics are there. We know them. So that's all I have to say. They're there. They're just not being adopted because there's profit in ongoing white supremacy, colonialism, and racism. So the choice is again and again and again and again to violate already vulnerable bodies, and to think that violation somehow allows us to perform care. You know, to perform, oh, I care about the world, or an emotional response. To suffering, whether that's photojournalism or art, visual art.
Absolutely, no, Sarah's absolutely right. I think education institutes are in a bit of a dilemma, right? Because you have a dying media industry, so you have lesser jobs, you have fewer people who can hire you. So let's just even look at New York. I mean, you go to ICP, you will find yourself under huge debt. You can teach a student as many ethics as you want, or they maybe don't even teach them. They know exactly what the ethics are, but when they're standing outside the doors of the New York Times, there are certain decisions they have to make. And at that point, and this is a discussion that came up in our workshops in New York, which is I felt bad teaching my students to work ethically, realizing that I may be ruining their careers because they won't be able to get jobs at the newspapers. They won't be able to shoot for Time magazine if they start thinking too ethically about what needs to be done. And at some point, I think education institutions do that. I think if you look at Columbia Journalism, which publishes a very fine magazine called Columbia Journalism Review, where they raise very difficult and important questions about the problems of journalism. So it's not as if institutions are not conscious of them. But at some point in this really tough market where people can barely make ends meet as professional media professionals, and more increasingly, people with money are the ones who can afford to become, say, photographers. People with money who can afford to live in New York on an intern's pay are the ones who are eventually get the jobs and go and shoot. So there are certain dilemmas that I think people face, especially in the West, where there are not that many positions. You tend to keep quiet. You don't want to rock the boat, blah, blah, blah. I mean, students tell me these things all the time. They have to do what they need to do to hold on to their jobs or even get the job, right? So there's this gap that we shouldn't ignore. Again, it's the political economy speaking in some fashion. So
Neelika, that article you just put in, I don't know whether everybody sees it on, but I would just encourage anybody by Zoe to go and read it. I think it's an extraordinary piece of writing. I think every class of photographers and probably everyone else should read it. You don't have to agree with it, but they should certainly read it and be challenged by it. It's it's really one of the best things I've ever read. And Zoe is something else. She's incredible. But that really challenges the whole idea, the whole ideology of, who photographs are for and what they actually do. And it's very confrontational, but it's absolutely brilliant. And I teach I'm more honest than Asim. I tell the students, if you want to get on in that industry, in that part of industry, then you will need to cheat. You will. That's who's got on. We know, we can look at the photos, you can see if it's too good to be true, it is. If we decide it's aesthetics that matter, then we know what's going on, and I confront them with that idea. You're going to have to make a choice. Personally, I don't think it's worth it, but that's my personal opinion. But I think that is just being honest with them, which is what you're basically saying, Asim, really.
Yeah, I mean, I had a student ask me, I gave a talk about the myth of the war photographer, and
yeah,
I was making fun of embedded war photographers and so on. And he asked me, like, okay, well, he's like, well, what do we do then? Should I go and work for the New York Times? And I think my response to him was, look, you need to be honest about what you are doing when you're working for the New York Times. I can't stop you from making a living or tell you not to do the work you need to do to put food on your table. This is not a world, this is not the 1960s when you can build careers out of photography. You need to do what you need to do, but don't lie about it. In the end, you need to understand, if you're embedding with the American forces and covering, sexy American fighter pilots on a aircraft carrier, it's not journalism. Don't sell it as that. Don't claim it as that. Just go do your job and then do something else that you want to call journalism on your own. There are lots of photojournalists who are wedding photographers. They have chosen to walk away from, who are shooting food, who are producing amazing work, and they find other ways to do it. And today we can confront the institutions and find other ways to keep ourselves going, which I think more and more people need to do, but people are still not willing to do it. At least not as many photographers that I think should be out there self-funding their important journalistic work in many ways, even through insurance or whatever, jobs and insurance. So I'm doing it through a PhD.
Yeah, I know what you're saying.
Yeah, I had to reduce myself to a PhD research program to do the work I want to do.
Amy, can I go back to you for another question?
So there's one last question from Yusuf, which you may have seen in the chat. Thank you so much for this conversation. As a Black photo editor for an NGO that works in Africa, I see this issue of the gaze of white supremacy all the time. What's a book or text that each of the panelists would recommend for people who are interested in learning more? So there were a few in the chat already that you shared, Neelika and Sarah.
I think there's some texts. I'm sorry. Can I go? Can I say?
Yeah, sure.
I think the works that were, Saidiya, of course, Hartman, Tina Campen, these are incredible bodies of work. What's interesting about them is that they're speaking not just about photographs, right? They're actually speaking about certain histories and ways of recovering certain ways of seeing the world and being in the world. And I, in fact, I happen to have Tuawahi Smith's book, Decolonizing Methodologies, because it's a lot of the, she's a New Zealand scholar. It's a beautiful book. It's from the 1990s. So to something, I think someone mentioned earlier that these conversations have been going on for a while. And they're not just about the photograph, right? What we are trying to speak about are the things that so many different decolonial struggles have been trying to speak about, which is trying to reclaim our full humanity in front of people who represent us. And these struggles, I think this is what Tina did with her beautiful book about listening to images, and I'm thinking of Christina White, which she did with In the Wake. which was constantly reminding us of the histories we need to keep in front, so that we can, when we speak about communities and countries or peoples, right, we understand the various overlapping histories that have left us here, left us in many very dark circumstances, rather than just speak of them in cultural and ethical essentialisms and generalizations.
So having listened to the conversation, I want to read Sarah's books. So that's going on my list.
Yeah.
It better go on your list.
Yeah, I'm sold. So,
I saw the sales numbers for Draw Your Weapons, and I was like, I think I know more people than that. I really like the book. I really love Civil Contract of Photography by Ariella Azoulay. And Benjamin, I'd be curious what you think about it. She writes about, I had a real problem with one part where she talks about missing images of rape. And I was like, I'm still thinking about it several years later, so I'd be curious.
just the only thing I'll ever say about that, and I often talk about it, is I had a very abusive childhood, and one of the things I always talk about is the thing that would make me more angry than anything else is the idea of a camera being in the room. Yeah, because now I own my story. I own it. It's my story. It's nobody else's, and I've reclaimed it, which is brilliant. But the camera in the room, that takes your story. That's someone else. And that's something I feel really strongly about. But there's always a danger, isn't there, going off one person's personal experience and then extrapolating that out for everybody else. But I think, yeah, there's some serious problems with those images. Anyway, we won't get into that.
And we've just been told, like, a suggestion that we come up with a reading list together, but I'm also hoping that we invite many people to contribute towards a volume within the next year, the contribution, but that next year is obviously not going to be the publication date. But I think these are ongoing conversations, and the more of us speaking about it, the better. But I would also say, like, outside of books, follow some people on Twitter. There are some amazing blogs, and blogs are still like viable spaces in which dissent is spoken and independent. I learned about Sarah's book through her writing online. So there's so many avenues for us to find each other, find those dissenting voices. And my critical education maybe began in the classroom with, Said's Orientalism, but it sure didn't end with the classroom. It's now like on Twitter, essentially, and elsewhere. I have one last question that was sent to me via email, and it's Jason Bate has asked, in the context of, say, medical photographs and patients, do you think such images, which were originally made without the doctor seeking consent from patients to take their picture, that its representation requires more sensitive handling? And that's a very kind of broad way of saying, how do you handle that? And he's asked some other kind of related questions about consent that essentially have to do with how can we ensure that a public audience can view photographs of atrocity, war crimes, or graphic medical records, quote, safely? I'm not sure that one can. And really, he's asked this question that I think already creates a problem, that how can we, what if we didn't show those graphic images because of political and ethical reasons? What do we lose? I think we're losing a lot by showing it, because we've already decided whose bodies we're going to show and who's not, and whose lives are being destroyed by it rather than the body. Because why are we even reducing people to a body rather than thinking about their life and the continuation of lives who have to now deal with being objectified in that horrific kind of manner? So I want to put that to you and ask how you might respond to that.
Just make one. I'm not really going to respond in a certain way. I just remember a picture of it was Haiti, the earthquake, and it was a nominee Magnum photographer took I don't remember the name of the guy. He took a picture, and it's all of the bodies. It's a dumpster truck. It's going down, and the bodies are piling out into a thing. This was in a fine art gallery for sale. And, you know, so there's taking pictures, which is important. Images, you know, photographic records, really, really important. This is what Candice is talking about in terms of archives, and so important. And then there's how we make commodities of them and what the industry, you know, pushes. And so I think all of that needs to be thought through very, very carefully. And that was, for me, I was like, wow, you know, the exploitation. But, you know, imagery is important. And I think it's important to take photographs. I think news, you know, there is a role. And if we stop, if we say you can't take photographs, that you can get into a very dangerous place in society where people are not allowed to take images. There's not a level of control I'm comfortable with for politicians to make those decisions.
I think part of what's going on is like, yes, these are what's being asked us is about questions around the issue of consent, but it's also looking at images as, you know, like as objects of transmission, reproduction, and communication, but without the politic of that. That consent doesn't happen without power. Transmission of images, sharing of looking at images doesn't happen without power relationships being part of that. And there's no way to discuss whether communication is happening and why, or is it a good thing to remove this or not? Like, you know, just like the Confederate statues, or like the bust of Cecil Rhodes or something like that. Should these images be there? When are we erasing history? Are we not communicating some kind of history or event that happened if we remove it? But the issue is that, why did Cecil Rhodes's bust get to be there? It's because he was a very powerful man who stole land, chased off the people who lived on it, was incredibly violent. He didn't get to have his image there on Table Mountain without that violence present. So we're not just like saying take away images, that images aren't just transmitting information. Medical images are not just transmitting information. They've come with an enormously violently unequal power relationship. And that's the conversation I think that's important for us to have, rather than what are we losing by removing an image. I'm saying, what are we gaining by examining those power relationships?
Yeah, it's interesting that this question of ethics has suddenly come up during COVID-19, because it was the fact that we would have to photograph majority European white bodies dying. No one asked this question during the HIV crisis in Africa, where photographers traipsed all over people's lives in the most disgusting fashion, literally walking into people's homes and photographing them with atrocious lack of concern and dignity. And now suddenly everyone is talking about ethics of photographing the ill and the sick and so on and so forth. So,
well, Ebola asked him most recently. Ebola, very recently.
Yeah, precisely.
Very recently.
So, to Neelika's point about power, this is power. The power that you, as a European photographer, and I apologize, Jason, because I don't know him, but I'm assuming, but you as a European photographer, you think twice about walking into the home of a sick family and thinking, how can I approach them in a civilized fashion? How can I approach them in an appropriate fashion with dignity, with respect for them and concern for their well-being? But these questions go right out the window when these photographers jump on a plane and they land in India or they land in Africa and they're like, I'm on assignment, I gotta bloody well get into your house and I gotta photograph that 80-year-old, I mean, I'm talking about South African photographer, what's his name, who photographed this 80-year-old woman in the nude. What's his name? Famous photographer. Now he was making excuses.
Oh God!
Was suffering from HIV. No, it wasn't Bert Sturton.
Oh my God, he's unbelievable, that guy.
But the fact that this question,
there's so many of those.
And exactly, there's so many of them.
Got a child to undress and took a picture to show a scar naked. I mean, Joe.
It is also a question of power. This is very much what power is, the fact that you're even asking this question. And we are looking at this and thinking, wow, you actually asked this question, because when you photograph, you know, us, this question was never even on the table.
Yeah.
And, you know, and to also to Neelika about consent, you know, consent, a lot of photographers hide behind consent, this excuse of consent, but consent also ignores the issue of power. You can coerce consent. You can, you know, how much consent does a woman who has to sell her body have to stop a photographer paying her so that he can take photographs of her having sex with other men? So these questions, you know, are coming up now, of course, but, you know, it's very convenient.
Yeah, I mean, the same is true for the photographs that Benjamin was talking about at the very beginning, the child abuse photographs. Those children were paid probably to be with the photographer in the room to take the ones who are being framed as sex workers essentially, but they are
and the fixer who took them there.
The fixer who took them there, and you know, more recently, the New York Times had photographs of a person who was having an epileptic fit in Sri Lanka, and the story was about, you know, why shouldn't you? Because the family gave consent. But this is the complicated thing about this consent, is that it's actually not complicated. They're often very poor people, and a white person coming in, you're also, you know, about like a culture of hospitality, and also you keep power to the person who's white in your presence. So that family would have welcomed that person, probably fed him a meal, and not even thought about what does this do to our dignity and us, and how is our subjectivity being framed by this photographer, and then the photo editor, and the massive newspaper or massive institution that is the New York Times.
Sorry.
No, please go ahead.
Sarah, please do.
I just thought, I was glad that Austin brought up the COVID-19, because we've had over 200,000 deaths in the United States. We haven't seen a single body at the same time that we get to watch George Floyd be murdered by police officers. So I'm not saying that I want not to see George Floyd, like the fact that so many murders of BIPOC people in the United States are hidden. You know, it's only people pay attention when there's images, but the fact that there's all these hidden bodies makes it so that image of George Floyd can't even do the work it needs to do, because by the fact of being visible, he's marked as other, and his life is not as important as other lives, which is exactly why he was what allowed him to be killed. So I think the fact of having, you know, these missing archives of war dead, missing archives of COVID dead, should make us suspect of any image that we actually do get to see. Why is that, and what narrative does it feed into, and why isn't it more disruptive?
Yeah. Candice, may I ask you to have the last word?
The last word. I want to show an image that I recently came upon, and it's, I don't know if you can see it.
Oh yeah,
we're seeing that, all right. How can we unsee it?
Yeah. Wow.
Well, so touching on this issue of consent, because I think when it comes around the use of archival images, and how and what the dynamics of consent becomes around these visual archives that kind of fall outside of copyright gambits, that also are and because of the work that's not necessarily being done around identifying images with photographers, so they kind of circulate around. I was really, and I apologize for sharing this, but I wanted to share it because I can't believe that these images have lives that are still in kind of circulation and are still being consumed. And because of these histories that are not being really kind of investigated around the history of these images, they circulate ahistorically, which I think becomes a really big problem. So Hasim, your question around consent is, it's not a simple thing about yes or no, legal or not legal. I think there's much bigger issues around our understanding of the history of these images and how they are allowed to circulate because they are financially viable.
I mean, in the same, these images, I think a few years back, and this is like seared in my head that, Design Indaba that happens every year in South Africa, there was a so-called design company that came up using the, that very powerful image of the slave ship hold. And it's a graphic that an artist produced as an abolitionist statement, but it was put on an ironing board cover because according to the designers, that it was a powerful image that fits so seamlessly with the shape of the ironing board. And there was an uproar, but they kept defending it, saying this, it's that these images of violence can have commercial lives and be profit-making. Is amazing that one can't see how you're still profiting off of people's lives and bodies like that. And so, yeah, I can show you images of it because I remember writing blog posts about it back when I was part of a different project. So we have many cases of that, but it was shocking, Candace, to see that's an iPhone cover that's being sold for $30 and a duvet cover. Who is going to sleep under that? Who wants to sleep under that? Who wants to buy that? Any concluding remarks before we say goodbye to everybody? And thank you for staying with us for more than 2 hours. It's been a marathon session, and I'm really grateful for your attention and for your attendance. These are not easy issues to resolve. They're not resolvable. They are an ongoing kind of work. And I'm grateful for all of your company, and especially those of you who are panelists today, that you've sustained me and given me critical language and courage too.
Yeah, no, thank you for the invite.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for the invite, and to the other panelists and everybody else coming along. I was very interested in this last image, and the one thing I guess we haven't talked about, we're not going to have time to, but so much is that commodification, the money. Magnum Photos and Lens Culture used an image of a child being raped to advertise a photo competition, which was paid to enter because they thought that's what would get people to enter the competition. And so, we do have to think about the relationship between the images and the people are making money, and that's terrifying, upsetting, disgusting, and dangerous. But there it is, I mean, what an example to end on. Whoa, horrific.
Thank you so much, everybody. And if any of the panelists want to just have a moment to debrief, I can send you a different little Zoom link for us. And thank you so much, everybody, for coming. Christina, thank you for being here. I'm very, very grateful for your work and your writing. I've learned so much from it. Everyone, we can say our goodbyes.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Thank you, Dick.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
See you again, Ben. Do you want to?
Oh,
Do we leave?
I think so, but I can send you a link in case anybody wants to.